It was a regular Wednesday afternoon when my husband Dan dropped an unexpected bombshell. He had been offered a week-long business trip overseas. This meant leaving me alone in our house for the first time in years. Though I knew it was part of his job, the idea of being alone for that long made me anxious. Dan packed his bags, kissed me goodbye, and left with a cheerful smile, promising to check in every night. The house suddenly felt too big, too quiet. The first couple of days went by without much trouble. I worked from home, watched some TV, and took long walks around the neighborhood. But on the third day, things changed. That evening, I was lounging on the couch with a cup of tea when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I felt a slight twinge of curiosity mixed with unease. I opened the door to find Mark, Dan's best friend, standing there with a warm smile. "Hey, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in on you," he said casually, holding up a bottle of wine. "I know Dan's away, and it must be a bit lonely." Mark and Dan had been friends since college. They had that easy, comfortable friendship that stood the test of time. We all hung out occasionally, but I never had much one-on-one time with Mark. He was always around Dan, so we never really had the chance to get to know each other deeply. "Oh, thanks. You didn't have to do that," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He shrugged. "Just being a good friend." I didn't think much of it. After all, Mark was like family. We sat down, shared a glass of wine, and talked about the usual stuff: work, mutual friends, and how Dan was adjusting to the trip. The conversation flowed easily, and I found myself laughing more than I had in days. Mark had always been charming, but I realized I had never really paid attention to how genuinely kind and funny he could be. Before I knew it, 2 hours had passed, and we were still deep in conversation. There was something disarming about the way Mark listened, his attention unwavering. It was refreshing and unfamiliar. I hadn't felt this kind of connection in a long time. As the evening wore on, Mark looked at me with an intensity that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't inappropriate, but it was different. There was a moment, a fleeting one, where the air between us shifted. Neither of us acknowledged it aloud, but I could feel it. I brushed it off, convinced it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, he was Dan's best friend, and I was Dan's wife. There was no way Mark would ever cross that line, right? I quickly changed the subject, and, sensing that the night had gone on long enough, told Mark I needed to get to bed. He smiled, thanked me for the company, and left without hesitation. As I closed the door, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered in the air. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. The next morning, I woke up feeling a bit off. The evening with Mark played on my mind more than it should have. I told myself it was nothing, just the result of having company when I was feeling unusually vulnerable with Dan gone. Yet there was this nagging voice in the back of my head, replaying the subtle shift in the air between us. I busied myself with work, trying to shake off the thoughts, but they crept in at unexpected moments, when I was making coffee, when I glanced at the couch where we had talked the night before. What bothered me more was the fact that I was thinking about Mark at all. This was someone I'd known for years, someone who had always been in the background of my life, just a friendly face. Why was I suddenly noticing him in a different way? By the afternoon, I couldn't resist the urge to talk to someone. I called my friend Lily, the one person who would listen without judgment. "So Mark came by last night," I started, trying to sound casual. "Mark? Dan's friend? What for?" she asked, her tone immediately curious. "Just to check in on me, I guess. We had a few glasses of wine and talked. It was nice." I hesitated, but she pressed. I sighed. "I don't know. There was this moment A moment I can't explain. It wasn't anything, but it felt like something. Lily was silent for a beat. And what did he do exactly? Nothing, I said quickly. That's the thing. It wasn't anything specific. It was more like a feeling, like we were both aware of something we weren't supposed to be aware of. Lily hummed thoughtfully. Well, that's tricky. I mean, he's Dan's best friend. Maybe it was just the wine talking. Maybe, I replied, though deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on anything but that conversation. But Mark seemed to occupy every corner of my mind. It was absurd. He was just being a good friend, and I was overthinking it because I was lonely. That evening, as I sat down for dinner alone, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. Had a great time last night. Hope I didn't overstay my welcome. I stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. I typed out a few different replies before settling on a simple, not at all. It was nice to have company. A few minutes later, his reply came in. Glad to hear that. I was thinking of stopping by again tomorrow if you're free. No pressure, of course. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to avoid whatever this was turning into. But the other part, the one that had been lonely and bored for days, was tempted. It wasn't like anything would happen, I told myself. It was just another visit from a friend. Sure, tomorrow works, I replied before I could overthink it. The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy. I couldn't stop thinking about what I was doing. Was I setting myself up for something I couldn't control, or was this all in my head? That evening, Mark arrived again, this time with takeout in hand. We sat at the kitchen table, eating and talking like we had the other night. But this time, the energy between us was even more charged. Every laugh, every glance felt heavier, as though we were both skirting around something unspoken. At one point, I caught him staring at me a little longer than usual, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I quickly looked away, feeling the weight of guilt settle in. This is ridiculous, I thought to myself. He's Dan's friend. Nothing is going to happen. As the evening wore on, it became clear that whatever had been brewing the night before was still there. We danced around it with small talk and casual conversation, but the tension was undeniable. And then, without thinking, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned. Mark, do you ever wonder what would happen if we weren't tied to other people? He looked at me, surprised but not shocked. There was a pause, and then he answered, his voice quiet. I've thought about it more than I should. I hadn't expected that. My heart raced, and I felt a strange mixture of excitement and panic. I'm sorry, I stammered. I don't know why I said that. Mark shook his head, his expression soft but serious. No, don't apologize. I've been feeling something too, but I don't want to ruin anything. You and Dan, that's sacred. His words hit me hard, and I realized how close we were to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. Yeah, I love Dan. Mark leaned back, exhaling deeply. I know, and I respect that. But I won't lie. It's hard being around you sometimes. There's this connection that I can't ignore. For a long moment, we sat in silence, both of us contemplating the reality of what was happening. We had acknowledged something that neither of us wanted to, and now there was no going back. As Mark stood up to leave, he looked at me one last time. I should go before we make a mistake. I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as he walked out the door. The house felt even emptier after he left, and I was left to face the complicated mess of emotions swirling inside me. The day after Mark's second visit, I woke up feeling a sense of relief and dread all at once. A part of me was glad that we had come to our senses, but the other part couldn't stop thinking about the depth of our conversation, about how close we came to doing something that could shatter my marriage. Dan called me later that morning, checking in from his trip. His voice was warm and familiar, yet I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at me. I listened to him talk about his meetings, his coworkers, and how much he missed me. Each word felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I found myself responding automatically, trying to sound upbeat and normal, but I was far from it. I felt like I was living in two worlds, one where I was Dan's loving wife, and another where Mark had stirred feelings I wasn't ready to confront. Later that evening, I decided to call Mark just to make sure everything was still normal between us. I didn't want things to be awkward, but I also needed to make sure we were both on the same page, that nothing had changed. "Hey," I said when he answered, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to make sure we're okay, after last night." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Yeah, we're fine," he said, but his voice lacked the easygoing tone he usually had. "Are you sure? I don't want things to be weird between us," I pressed. Mark sighed softly. "Look, it's not weird, but I'm not going to lie. I think we need to be careful. Whatever this is, it's dangerous for both of us." I knew he was right. "I agree. I don't want to mess things up." "Neither do I," he said, "but it's hard, I've been thinking about you a lot more than I should, and I know that's wrong. Dan's my best friend, and you're his wife." His honesty was disarming, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. I had felt the same, and hearing him admit it out loud made everything more real. "We have to stop this, Mark," I finally said, my voice firm. "Whatever this is, it can't go any further. I love Dan, and I can't hurt him like that." Mark's voice softened. "I know. I get it. I don't want to hurt him either." There was a long silence between us, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. I knew we had to put an end to this tension, to whatever had been building between us. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I realized how hard it was going to be. After we hung up, I felt a strange sense of finality. It was the right decision, I told myself. Mark and I couldn't be anything more than friends, no matter what unspoken connection we might feel. But despite that, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss. Something had shifted between us, and there was no going back. The next few days passed in a blur. I threw myself into work, into keeping busy, anything to avoid thinking about Mark or the complicated emotions swirling inside me. Dan was due back in a couple of days, and I was determined to put all of this behind me before he returned. But things didn't go as planned. The day before Dan was supposed to come home, I got a text from Mark. "Can we talk?" My heart sank. I knew I shouldn't respond, but something in me couldn't resist. I couldn't leave things unresolved. "Sure," I typed back, feeling a pit form in my stomach. That evening, Mark came over again. I had promised myself this would be the last time, that we would have one final conversation to clear the air and then go back to our normal lives. But the moment he walked in, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. We sat on the couch, both of us avoiding eye contact for a while. The tension was palpable. "I'm sorry," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. "I shouldn't have texted you. I've been struggling with everything, and I didn't know what else to do." I shook my head. "It's not your fault. This whole thing just got out of hand. We should have never let it get this far." Mark looked at me, his expression serious. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about you, and that's the problem. I don't want to feel this way, but I do." I swallowed hard, feeling my own emotions rise to the surface. We can't do this, Mark. It's not fair to Dan. It's not fair to either of us. He nodded slowly. You're right. It's not fair. But it doesn't make it any easier. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything hung between us, unspoken but understood. I could feel the pull between us, the temptation to let something happen, to give in to whatever this was. But I knew that if we crossed that line, there would be no turning back. I can't, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I can't do this. Mark stood up, running a hand through his hair. I know, I should go. But neither of us moved. We were both frozen in place, standing on the edge of a precipice we didn't want to fall into. Finally, Mark turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at me. For what it's worth, I care about you, but I won't be the one to ruin your marriage. And with that, he was gone. As the door closed behind him, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had made the right choice, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like I had lost something important, something I hadn't even realized I wanted. The next day, Dan came home. His warm embrace was familiar and comforting, but I felt a distance within myself that I couldn't explain. I smiled, laughed at his stories, and fell back into the rhythm of our life together. But something had changed. Mark and I didn't speak again after that night. We avoided each other, silently agreeing to let whatever had almost happened fade into the background. It was easier that way, safer. As time passed, the tension dissolved into memory, but it left a mark, one that neither of us would ever admit to, a reminder that even the strongest boundaries can bend under the weight of unspoken feelings. And though I never crossed that line, I knew I had come dangerously close.